Hello, everyone. So, I'm going to be giving you an overview of the age debate in juvenile justice and the neuropsychological perspective to it. Now, specifically, this is important in the context of our current JJ Act, which provides for adolescents between the age group of 16 to 18 years of age to be tried as adults. So, I want to discuss the psychological and the neuropsychological standpoint uh, to this age related debate. So basically, these are the elements that I would be taking you through. I would be talking about the developmental perspective to juvenile delinquency and persistent criminality or criminal behavior, which is seen in adults, so criminality in adults. Then I would be talking about the neuropsychology of adolescent offending, wherein basically we would be looking into the neurological basis of offending in adolescents and even individuals younger than that, in children and adolescents. We would then be addressing the idea of intellectual maturity and psychosocial maturity and how the two are different, and this difference is of extreme importance and relevance to us. And finally, of course, the idea of retribution versus rehabilitation. So, should juveniles within the age bracket of 16 to 18 years be tried as adults, or is that incorrect from a psychological standpoint? So, coming to the development, starting with the developmental perspective to criminality and delinquency. Basically, the now there are several ideas which have been discussed in this context, but one of the most important contemporary idea in the area is the path theory, or specifically two developmental pathways, as was proposed by Terry Moffat. Now Moffat essentially highlighted the fact that uh, offenders, juvenile offenders, and even adults to that extent, essentially take one of the two pathways to criminality. So they could either take the life course persistent pathway, and individuals who take this pathway, criminals who take this pathway, would in turn be called life course persistent offenders, or they engage in adolescent limited offending patterns, so adolescent limited offenders, right? Now, life course persistent offenders, as the name suggests, engage in criminal behavior almost throughout their lifetime. So criminality begins early in childhood. There's manifestation of behavioral problems and deviances in behavior pretty early on in life. These behavioral problems continue through the teenage years. They continue through the childhood years, through adolescence or the teenage years, wherein these individuals then engage in delinquent behavior known as juvenile delinquency. And this criminality or this offending pattern persists through adulthood as well, wherein this individual would then engage in adult criminality, right? So life course persistent offenders, as the name suggests, wherein criminality begins early on in life and continues throughout the life of an individual well into adulthood. By contrast, adolescent limited offending patterns are limited to the teenage years of an individual or the adolescence in an individual. So again, as the name suggests, the developmental histories of these individuals do not demonstrate any early antisocial problems. So during childhood, as children, these individuals would have led normal childhoods, would have had normal childhoods, would have led normal lives, and there would not have been behavioral deviances in these individuals. Whereas during adolescence, they engage in some deviant and offensive behavior patterns. So, antisocial behavior manifests itself during adolescence, and then again as adulthood sets in. So, as this individual enters adulthood, this deviant behavior again dissipates, and the individual then again falls back into the normal life course or the normal trajectory, right? um, so, talking about the life course persistent offenders, and as is evident, it is the life course persistent offenders which are of relevance to us, because these individuals are the ones who are likely to engage in persistent criminal behavior. At adolescent limited offending, on the other hand, would is limited to the teenage or the adolescent years and would dissipate eventually as adulthood sets in, right? So the life course persistent offenders are this trajectory is associated with a typical sequence of experiences and symptoms in an individual, and this trajectory is it's accompanied by experiences and symptoms which are sort of overlapping, which are at least relatively common to individuals who follow this trajectory. So to begin with, the idea of what causes deviant behavior in an individual, right? So again, that gets us back to our classical nature nurture debate. Is an individual born a certain way, or does an individual become a certain way because of the life experiences that an individual has had? So either an adverse context, a social setup, a socio-cultural environment which is extremely adverse, or inborn neuropsychological problems. So neurological problems then also become extremely important. So either an adverse context or neurological biological problems uh, which result in to begin with temperamental problems in an individual. So a child who has a bad temperament, for instance, or an adverse context wherein the child's parents engage in extremely harsh parenting with the child. This in turn results in uh, the most initial signs of deviant behavior, which are likely to be reflected in what is known as ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? So now attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a clinical condition. It's a disorder which is diagnosed by a psychologist or a clinician, and we would be talking about ADHD and its specific symptoms in the next slide. But for now, to begin with, as the name suggests, it is marked by a deficiency in attention, inattention, and hyperactivity in a child, also accompanied by impulsivity in the child, right? Uh, this, along with, say, for instance, a child who has temperamental problems, would not be ready, would not be as well prepared as any regular child for school. So, when this child enters school with a bad temperament, he's more likely to generate and create adverse experiences in one's surroundings, which in turn is likely to have a detrimental effect on this child, right? So, harsh parenting and temperamental problems essentially resulting in uh, poor readiness for school, or a condition like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which in turn is more likely to result in a rejection from peers when the child goes to school and interacts with other children. So a child who has a bad temperament, who has a condition like ADHD, who's not as socially well mannered as the other children, is more likely to be rejected by the peers. And once rejected by the normal social group, the child then is more likely to engage with deviant peers. So then rejection by the normal peer group, uh, and that accompanied by socialization with a peer group which is deviant in nature, which engages in deviant behavior, is also likely to result in a lot of learning, a lot of modeling of deviant behavioral patterns. Now, this in turn uh, is likely to result in, well, failure at school, low parental monitoring. So if if there are parental problems in the parent-child relationship which the child is experiencing, then early harsh parenting um, very early on, and slightly later in life, a lack of adequate amount of monitoring which the child gets from the parents, lack of supervision from the parents, of course, failing at school once the child enters the school system, the formal education system, and an associated condition which is known as oppositional defiant disorder. So we're also going to talk about that in the next slide. But for now, oppositional defiant disorder again is a clinical condition. It's a diagnosable disorder in children. And as the name suggests, it's marked by defiance and oppositional attitude towards authority. So, oppositional defiant disorder, defiance and opposition towards authority. Right. So, we'll also look at that in the next slide when we look at it from the clinical perspective. Now, all of these experiences, bad temperamental problems, inherent neurological problems, a poor context, harsh parenting, low parental monitoring, rejection by normal peer groups, and the like, is likely to then take the form of conduct problems in children, and can also take the form of a full-fledged conduct disorder. Right. So again, a clinical condition, a conduct disorder, which is diagnosed in children, which again we're going to talk about in the next slide. Um, Now, conduct problems during childhood or conduct disorder during childhood resulting in violent behavior or problematic deviant behavior during adolescent years, and that resulting in full-blown, full-fledged criminal behavior during the adulthood of an individual, or adult criminality. So this is typically the sequence of experiences and the symptoms which are a part of the life course persistent trajectory as defined by Terry Moffat, right? Talking about the clinical conditions associated with childhood disorder. Now, even if you look at the previous slide, we are talking about ADHD first, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, followed by oppositional defiant disorder, followed by conduct problems later on in life, right? So usually this is the chronological order in which the disorders progress. Now, what specifically are all of these conditions? Now, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder typically can be diagnosed very, very early on in life, also is known to have a neurological basis. So again, that's where the neuropsychology, the neurological basis of deviant and criminal behavior becomes important. So ADHD, which also has a neurological basis, um, typically is marked by three important symptoms, right? And all of these symptoms are in accordance with the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders. And it's the fifth version of the DSM, so DSM 5 that we're currently using. So the first symptom which marks ADHD is inattention. And as the name suggests, it is marked by a child having very, very small or very limited attention span. So the child typically will have a problem in sustaining one's attention. Very often fails to give close attention to details. And which in turn is manifested in a lot of careless mistakes which the child might make at school, or even during preschool years. Like I said, ADHD is present very, very early on in life. So a lot of mistakes which the child is likely to make in school, or even before the child enters school. Um, it's also marked by the child failing to follow instructions very often. And this failure to follow instructions is not because the child is oppositional or the child is disobedient. It's simply because the child did not pay attention to the entire instruction that was being given to the child. So the attention span is so small that, for example, the teacher in the school gives homework to children, and the child is not able to sustain one's attention through the homework instructions which the teacher is giving. In turn, the child would perhaps not even know that the teacher has asked the children to do the homework in a certain way. And so it's because of the failure of the child, the ability of the child to sustain one's attention, that the child doesn't even know that something needs to be done in a certain way, and therefore fails to do it. So it's not a reflection of disobedience, it's a reflection of the inability to sustain one's attention, right? um, the second important essential symptom of ADHD is hyperactivity. Again, as the name suggests, the child is too hyperactive. So the child, it can manifest by way of being too fidgety. The child is extremely fidgety, is always moving the hands and the feet around, is unable to sit in one's place for a long time. So in the classroom, for example, the child gets up, runs around the class all the time. Um, a child that talks excessively and creates problem by excessive talking and excessive fidgety behavior in the child, runs around the class all the time. So that is a reflection of hyperactivity. And by hyperactivity, I don't mean a child who's simply high on energy. A child who has a very very low ability, for example, to sit still in one's place even for a short duration of time. So an extreme amount of activity is implied here. The last important symptom here is that of impulsivity. So a child who probably has difficulty in waiting for one's turn, for example, a child who always interrupts the other one simply because the child cannot wait for one's turn to speak. That is marked by that's how impulsivity is reflected in very young children. The second disorder to develop, which is important here, is oppositional defiant disorder. Now, like I said, as the name suggests, it is marked by defiance towards adults or authority figures. Again, there are three important symptoms which are a reflection of ODD. The first one is angry and irritable moods, which can be reflected in the child losing one's temper very frequently and very, very easily. The child is easily annoyed, is very emotional and touchy, and gets annoyed and angered. And the child is also often resentful and angry. And this behavior is not just towards one's siblings, but is also towards the parents of the child or some adult figure who's involved in taking care of the child. Um, the second symptom is argumentative and defiant behavior. So the child argues with authority figures or with adults, and this argument, of course, is excessive in nature. The child might also actively defy or refuse to comply with the requests from authority figures simply because the child wants to defy authority, or the child not following rules even though there might seemingly be no valid reason or sufficient reason for the child not doing that, but the child simply doesn't follow rules because the child doesn't want to follow rules. um, the child, it's also sometimes marked with the child blaming others for one's mistakes, and that's the argumentativeness of the child. So blaming others, and usually adults around oneself, for one's mistakes is again a reflection of argumentative defiant behavior, and could also be, for example, be reflected in the child who deliberately wants to annoy others, so deliberately creates trouble for the adults or the caregiver to simply to annoy them. And the third important symptom here is vindictiveness, simply being spiteful or vindictive, extremely spiteful, uh, uh, is a reflection of vindictiveness, right? The third condition in the set of clinical conditions here is conduct disorder. Now, conduct disorder again usually is, like I said, that usually these behaviors occur, these conditions occur in this chronology. So conduct disorder usually is seen in children who are at least school age, or adolescent or pre-adolescent children. Conduct disorder is marked by a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or are violated, or at least the major age appropriate societal norms or rules are violated by the child. So again, it's marked by four important set of symptoms or categories of symptoms. The first one is aggression against people or animals. So a child who excessively bullies others, or verbally threatens or intimidates other people. um, it could also include physical fights, so a child who engages in physical aggression against people or even animals. So cruelty to animals also would be a reflection of this symptom. The second one is destruction of property. So a child who destroys people just for the heck of destroying the property, or for example, deliberately setting fire with the intention to cause damage. So the fire setting has occurred with the sole intention of causing damage to the property which belongs to someone else. So all of this, again, like I said, is a reflection of behavior which violates the rights of other people, right? And that's the mark of the conduct disorder. Deceitfulness or theft, so stealing behavior, lies, which are uh, when a child lies to obtain favors from someone or to avoid some obligations. So lying to manipulate the behavior of someone else, or say for instance simply forgery is also a form of deceitfulness. So any of these behaviors is a reflection of deceitfulness or theft. And the final one, which is serious violations of rules. So when the child begins to break rules, or even an adolescent, so conduct disorder is also an adolescent phenomena. So when the child begins to violate rules, truancy at school, not going to school for no apparent reason, or running away from home, not following rules which have been there and which have been established over a long period of time. All of these would be a reflection of conduct disorder in the child. And of course, doing all of this excessively. So every child every now and then wants to miss school, or wants to break a curfew and not listen to parents. But an excessive engagement in these behaviors would then be a reflection of conduct disorder. Of course, if you get into the details of this disorder, of these disorders in the DSM criteria, there would be a lot more details, but we won't get into those details. The purpose was just to give you an overview of these conditions of childhood, which are also associated with persistent criminality, right? So ADHD occurring very early on in life in children as young as 2 or 3 years of age, followed by oppositional defiant disorder in, again, preschool and school age children, and conduct disorders, which again is seen in school age children and even adolescents. Now, also having said that, when an individual engages in behavior patterns which are a reflection of conduct disorder, but they also violate the law, then that becomes the phenomena which we understand as juvenile delinquency. So engaging in behavior patterns which are associated with conduct disorder, which also violate the law, are a reflection of juvenile delinquency, so delinquency in adolescents. And if these behavior patterns occur in an adult, so for the diagnosis of conduct disorder, the person has to be below 18 years of age. So all of these, like I said, are conditions associated with childhood. And if similar behavior patterns occur during adulthood, then the clinical diagnosis which is given usually is antisocial personality disorder, unless the behavior patterns of an individual do not fit into the assessment criteria of antisocial personality disorder. Um, but in most cases, usually that doesn't happen. So uh, what we're also talking about here is the developmental trajectory of persistent criminality. So ADHD followed by oppositional defiant disorder, followed by conduct disorder during adolescence, which can also take the form of juvenile delinquency. And when this continues into adulthood, it takes the form of persistent criminality. psychologically, from a clinical standpoint, a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder is then warranted in those cases, right? Okay, so again, basically, what we're saying is that uh, as the child, in the case of life course persistent criminals, as the child grows and develops, the manifestation of antisocial behavior also changes progressively, and basically, it evolves along with the development of the child, right? So as the child grows and develops, the child's capabilities also change, they also grow and develop, and accordingly the behavior patterns manifested, the deviant behavior patterns manifested by the child also change and vary. So if you look at this depiction here, uh, roughly, again, we're not saying that at these ages specifically these behavior patterns will occur, but roughly consider that at around age 4, but even before that, children are more likely to engage in biting and hitting. In fact, very young children, as young as 1.5 years old, even before that, they bite when they get angry. So children as young as 3-4 years of age are more likely to engage in biting and hitting. Once the child grows a little, around the age of 10 for example, the child is more likely to engage in shoplifting and truancy, because again the child has now started going to school. The child can also miss the school at his or her own will. So shoplifting and truancy are more likely to develop by the age of 10. By age 16, so well into adolescence, the child is more likely to engage in behavior patterns like drug dealing, like substance abuse, like sexual misconduct. Also, because if you notice, around this age during adolescence, now the child is more capable of doing that. There are more opportunities the child gets for substance abuse and engaging in sexual misconduct. By the age of 22, so by the early adulthood of an individual, the person now is more likely to engage in behaviors like robbery or sexual assault. And of course, by the age of 30, the child is more likely to engage in fraud, maybe financial frauds, or even child abuse, right? So as we've noticed, the life course persistent offenders generally they commit a wide range of crimes, and their antisocial ways persist through adolescence well into adulthood. So antisocial ways actually begin during early childhood, they persist throughout their life through adolescence, and they continue well into adulthood. Now, what's important for us to note here is that there is no significant difference in the nature, the frequency, and the severity of crimes committed by the life course persistent offenders and the adolescent limited offenders during the adolescent phase, right? So, again, going back to our JJ Act, one of the basis for determining whether a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old should be tried as an adult or not is the nature of the crime. But what we're essentially saying here is that the nature or the severity of the crime or the heinousness of the crime is really no way in which we can differentiate between an individual who is engaging in criminality only during adolescent years, or who is likely to continue engaging in criminal behavior even during his adulthood and throughout his life, right? So if you look at this graph here, um, this is the graph which is plotted for the frequency and the severity of life course persistent offenders, and the lower lines, that's the graph for adolescent limited offending patterns. And if you notice, from about here, which is 14 and a half, 15 years of age, no, even before that, so 13, 14 years of age, till about 18 and a half years of age, you would see that these two lines are practically parallel to each other with not much difference, right? So if we're talking about somebody between who falls between 16 to 18 years age bracket, then typically there is really not any significant difference between the patterns, between the nature, the frequency, and the intensity or the severity of the crime which is committed by somebody who is essentially problematic for the society, so somebody who's a life course persistent offender, and somebody who is whose offending pattern is limited to the teenage or the adolescent years. Also, if you notice that beyond roughly about 18 years of age, uh, in adolescent limited offenders, the offending patterns, the frequency, severity, and the nature of offenses, specifically the frequency and the severity, in a natural course begins to decline gradually and goes down, majorly goes down, meaning that these individuals have, by the time they cross 30, in fact even before that, so by the time they hit 28, 27, 28 years of age, their criminality has decreased. Whereas in the life course persistent offenders, this criminal behavior continues to grow and increases in intensity even after 18 years of age, so even after adulthood has set in, right? But what we're essentially saying is that even though there is a significant difference at, say, about 26 years of age or 28 years of age, there really is no significant difference at 18 years of age between the criminality of life course persistent offenders and adolescent limited offenders. So what we're saying essentially is this: if we have to compare the two uh, offending patterns, in life course persistent offenders, we see early behavioral problems and socialization with a deviant peer group very early on in childhood. Whereas in adolescent limited offenders, these individuals have a normal childhood. They get socialized normally, and their behavior develops in an appropriate manner, meaning thereby that they, in their formative years, they've developed a normal behavioral repertoire. During adolescence, which is the problematic age, both these categories, the life course persistent offenders as well as the adolescent limited offenders, engage in deviant behavior patterns, and these deviant behavior patterns are functionally indistinguishable from each other. So the behavioral patterns of LCPs and ALs are pretty much similar as far as the nature of the offensive act, the intensity and the frequency of the offensive act is concerned. Whereas during adulthood, so as the individual crosses the 18 years age bar, enters into adulthood, and roughly by about 24, 25 and beyond, the LCPs continue to resort to deviant and criminal ways. In fact, the criminality grows in these individuals. And in adolescent limited offending, normal behavior patterns are restored based on an already developed behavioral repertoire. So what we're saying is that the ALs have developed a behavioral repertoire which is normal early on in childhood, and this takes precedence in their behavior again when they enter adulthood. Also, when they begin to realize through socialization that normal pro-social ways will perhaps be more productive and more growth oriented for them, they can switch back to their absolutely normal behavioral repertoire, which the LCPs are unable to do to begin with, also because their a normal pro-social behavioral repertoire has not even developed during early childhood, right? So it's impossible to track the difference here during adolescence, but where do we track the difference? Here during early formative years of life, right? So which is why training parents and training school teachers in observing potential behavioral problems in children is extremely important, and it's important to tackle those behavioral problems here, because once deviant behavioral patterns have taken shape, and they've rooted themselves firmly in the personality of an individual, then eliminating them or rectifying them during adulthood becomes extremely difficult, right? Okay.